Hi YouTube, and hello to EnigmaHood. This video is essentially going to be a response to a comment left by EnigmaHood on one of my videos where I was making an appeal to EnigmaHood to come to rationality with regards to a video that he had uploaded expressing his outrage at the Ferguson grand jury trial verdict on the shooting death of Michael Brown. And some language that I felt that he was using there that maybe could be incendiary, charges of racism and rationalizing looting and violence and that sort of thing. And some, what I would consider to be sort of erroneous conclusions about the criminal justice system. And really it was a call to rationality. It was a call to, sort of come to the table with dialogue. And so first of all, I want to say I appreciate EnigmaHood coming to the discussion in the way that he has. I think it shows a lot of character, and I really appreciate that. I also want to make a special thank you to the Space Frog for reminding me of what my stated intentions were when I made a request for clarification in the comments section of EnigmaHood's video, and then subsequently made a video kind of calling him out for something. And in this case, I really needed that, so I do appreciate that very much. With all of that said, let's go ahead and look at EnigmaHood's comment. From the start, your premise makes little sense. You want to be logical about an emotional problem. The whole reason for why people care about this murder is because of emotions. You can't remove emotion from the situation because then you have to wonder why you care at all. We can be logical about the nuances of the event, but to expect me not to be emotional about it is facile. If I wasn't emotional about it, I wouldn't care in the first place. Well, certainly, I understand that. I mean, we react emotionally whenever we see something that we feel is untoward, that has occurred to another human being, a brutalization, a rape, a murder, that sort of thing, of course. The call to rationality has to do with what we do with that emotion and after the fact. As a civilized society, we've come to the recognition that we don't always conduct ourselves in the best way when we react on emotion alone. And quite often there's facts and things that we don't know initially that need to be discovered. And we can, if we react too quickly and too emotionally, a lot of times we can act, it can be a miscarriage of justice. And so, we've had this recognition. So I'm not saying that you can't be emotional about something, but that in a civilized society, we have a recognition that we can actually do more harm than good when we react on emotion alone. And this is some of the reason we have a lot of the mechanisms that we have in place to avoid that. Let's continue. I'll give you an example. You go to the zoo and you see a chimpanzee rape another chimpanzee. Would you be appalled? Would you demand this chimp stand trial? Would you demand justice? No. Why? Because you don't have an emotional reaction to it. And since you don't have an emotional reaction to it, you don't care. Sure, you could make up a whole list of BS excuses like how chimps don't understand the consequences of their actions or how their brains aren't as developed as ours, or some other nonsense that you can't possibly prove and is ultimately irrelevant. But at the end of the day, the reason we don't demand justice for chimp rape is because no one cares. And no one cares because we don't have an emotional reaction to it. You don't get angry, you don't get sad, you don't care. Well, this is maybe an area where you and I differ, because I would be sad and or angry about seeing something like that occur in front of me. I have a soft spot for animals. I don't like to see an animal suffer. And so it would affect me emotionally. Now, in some ways, this is irrelevant, but it actually illustrates the whole point. And that is, well, if I reacted emotionally, what I would do is try to use reason to determine what to do about what I just witnessed. I mean, I might think about what actually takes place in the animal kingdom. I mean, I know that we don't accept that in our human interactions, but what about in the animal kingdom? And we could be empirical about it and actually determine these things. So you said something about making up a whole bunch of BS excuses or trying to find things that we can't possibly prove. Well, the whole point is we can prove some of those things. We can do studies, and they have done studies on animal behavior and how developed their brains are and how much they can comprehend certain things like that. And so that's what I would do. The rational thing to do would be to determine. It would be a little bit naive to think that in the animal kingdom, no animal ever harms another animal. And so it also would be a little silly, I think, knowing what we know about animal brain functioning, to think that they could somehow comprehend and there would be any point in in having him stand trial, for instance, that this animal could comprehend the gravity of what they had done, and that there'd be any point in punishing him or anything like that. These are things that we can rationally and empirically assess. Maybe one of the things that I would do is I would go to the actual zookeeper and ask some questions about, is this animal behavior natural? Is this something that you see often? Is it possible that these animals should be separated, etc., etc.? Rather than just sort of react emotionally. And I don't know, what would I do? Demand that the chimpanzee be shot, or maybe sneak back later and do it myself or something? I mean, that's the whole point right here, is a rational reaction, even if the impetus was an emotional response. I can also prove that you have an emotional reaction to the death of human beings. In the other video you made, where you were angry because of the comment that I made that you misinterpreted, you read my comment where I said he's probably better off that way, and then you just stared at the screen. You clearly were eliciting an emotional plea. Without actually saying it, you were saying, isn't what he said appalling, without actually constructing a logical argument as to why what I said is supposed to be wrong. You just had an emotional reaction to the idea that someone dying could be a good thing. Human beings are like that. That's why we care about murder, rape, and other crimes. If we did not have an emotional reaction to crime, we would not care. Well, first off, I do want to just say, yes, I did misinterpret your comment. Now, part of it was because you weren't real clear, and in these kind of emotionally charged arenas, it's probably a good idea to be clear, but I'm glad you made the clarification that you did, because I think it would have been appalling if you'd have made that statement, given all the other things that you'd said. Now, it may be appalling for different reasons. It's not just that I had an emotional reaction to what you said as being wrong, but also there was sort of a sense there that this was kind of internally contradictory, at least with some of the other things that you'd said. And so, it could be that my response was saying, oh, he's using the death of this person to further an agenda and actually doesn't care about the person, after, talking about a lot of the things that you said in your other video. So, I mean, a lot of that could be part and parcel of it. But again, the whole point is, even if I reacted emotionally, which, yeah, sure, okay, I had an emotional response to it, what is the rational thing to do then with that information after the fact, right? What is the rational and well-reasoned response? And there are many reasons why that's important. Of course, the proper carrying out of justice depends on that, right? Depends on us saying, okay, we react emotionally to this person being killed, for instance, but we need to make sure we gather all the facts and all the data and all the evidence before we try to right or wrong here somehow, right? Before we actually react in a irreversible manner. This is some of the reasons why we don't just take the family members of the person who was killed and then just put them in the room with the person that we might have thought had done it and let them have their way with them, right? As a civilized society, we recognize that vigilantism is not the way to conduct justice. It's for very similar reasons to the reason we don't recommend a surgeon perform surgery on his wife. Because we understand that he's got an emotional investment there, and it may actually cloud his judgment, right? And so, it's also the same reason that, for instance, a defense attorney can make a request for a change of venue, and this is recognized as being a reasonable thing to do. Because in a given geographical area, any pool of potential jurors from that area, could have had enough exposure to the event that actually took place that they can't be impartial, they can't be objective as jurors. They're emotionally invested already, and so they make a change of venue to somewhere where they can make sure that they can find impartial jurors who can assess all of the information and all of the testimony in an impartial way to come to what would be, hopefully a more just conclusion, a more accurate conclusion based just on the facts of the case and not an emotional reaction. These are the issues that I had, of course, with your initial video. And, it can be easily illustrated that we can make erroneous assumptions when we're that heavily emotionally invested. So I'm not sure what the timeline is here, but you'd made a video about Mark Wahlberg. And in that video, you were similarly impassioned and similarly emotional about Mark Wahlberg, and you made a lot of charges about him being a racist. And I have to say, EnigmaHood, with all of the emotional pleas that you've made, and very little rationality that I can actually see, I don't know how much information you have about Mark Wahlberg actually being a racist, but I'm inclined not to put too much stock into that based on just how emotionally you react, right? Because you haven't provided any evidence that he's racist. You've just sort of made the charge because he attacked someone of a different race. And the thing is, you even said that he deserves to be killed. So you've clearly got, I guess, a different vision of justice than the rest of your peers in your country. Because he didn't kill anybody, he simply attacked somebody. It sounds like it may have even been a single punch. I don't know if he repeatedly punched him, but part of the reason it seemed that you were making this appeal to him being killed was that he cost the man his eyesight in one eye. And this is clearly an emotional reaction or response, and I just wonder how much research you did into that and how much you knew about the actual event. First of all, it happened a long time ago. Neither you nor I were there, so you don't really know the severity of what happened. But it's subsequently come out that not only has the man that he attacked forgiven him, but he's actually come out to clear the record that he'd actually lost his eyesight in that eye during a time of war. It actually had nothing to do with Mark Wahlberg punching him. So here's an example, right on your own turf, where you've reacted emotionally. You've made some appeals to what you think should happen to this man. You've essentially convicted him yourself, and you didn't have all the facts. You were reacting purely emotionally, and you didn't have enough. You didn't use enough reason and rationality to recognize that you don't have all the facts, and that there may be other circumstances that you're not aware of, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? So I don't want to belabor the point too much, but I think it's really important to drive this home, because you seem to feel in your video that vigilantism is the natural result of a miscarriage of justice. But in a civilized society, we recognize that that's not the case, and that's why the government really doesn't have to worry about the entirety of the population rising up for a perceived injustice, because really the majority of the civilians in your country reject vigilantism, and they would prefer other forms of effecting change if that's necessary. Peaceful protest being one of them, and I fully support peaceful protest, and I think it's a great way for people to make their voices heard. I think a lot of good has been done in the past using peaceful protest. But to somehow suggest that our criminal justice system is just there to appease the bloodlust of the population, otherwise they'll resort to vigilantism, I think is maybe a little bit myopic. It's maybe actually projecting your particular view of crime and punishment and justice onto everyone else. And I think it's dangerous, of course, to react emotionally. And I think if there were a case where you or a family member was, say, unjustly accused of a crime, and everybody reacted emotionally and wanted to do this sort of tribal kangaroo court of public opinion kind of right conviction against them, and then attack them physically, et cetera, you'd really be crying out for rationality, right? You'd really be wishing everybody used their reason and a little bit of empiricism and waited till the facts were in and the physical evidence could be investigated, et cetera, right? Let's continue before I get any more long-winded. It was a racial event. Asserting that it wasn't doesn't make it not. A white police officer who is part of a predominantly white power structure murdered a black kid who is part of a predominantly black neighborhood. Whether the cop was racist has no bearing on whether it was a racial event. I suspect he's at least submissively racist, but again, it doesn't change the racial status of the event. I'm not really sure what you're trying to get at here in a lot of ways. I notice you've clawed back just a little bit because in your other video he was clearly a racist. Now you suspect he's at least submissively racist, but I'm not sure how you get to make that claim without some sort of evidence. To me, that's a racist statement. To make a claim of racism against somebody without any evidence behind it is kind of a racist thing to do, I think. To say that it was a racial event, well, I mean, if I go to a Starbucks and buy a coffee and the barista is an East Indian, I guess that's a racial event too, but what's the relevance of that? You know, and I guess if she's a female barista, then it's a gendered event. Okay. That doesn't have any impact on anything as far as I'm concerned. You also use some leading language here, right? A white police officer murdered a black kid. Well, there are extenuating circumstances that make it not a murder. It wasn't in cold blood. There was an altercation that took place. There's physical evidence that I think would lead to a conclusion, not to mention eyewitness testimony, that the black kid, who really just became an adult pretty much, right? So there's a little more leading language, actually attacked the police officer inside his own car. The physical evidence bears that out, as does some of the eyewitness testimony. That was supposed to part of a predominantly white power structure. Well, I don't know, predominantly white. I mean, I wonder what it's going to take to ever have that not be spoken of in that fashion, right? I mean, I recognize that, you know, the proportions are still more white than black, but so are the proportions of the population of the country. Predominantly white power structure. I don't know, you got a black president. The Attorney General is black. You've got Speaker Boehner. That's a joke. You know, and you've got black senators. You've got a lot of black police officers. I'm not saying that it's not predominantly white, but you say a black neighborhood that's supposed to be protected by the white power structure. Well, isn't that what they were doing to some degree? I mean, what was that officer doing? You know, the other 99% of his career that weren't shooting Michael Brown, what was he doing? Was he not working to protect, you know, this predominantly black neighborhood? I'm not sure. Whether the cop was racist has no bearing on whether it was a racial event. Well, yeah, but the cop being racist would be what would make that racial event, the racial nature of that event, relevant to any degree. I mean, I think that's what's important. It almost seems like you're clawing back a little bit, I think, on the racist nature of this by just saying, well, it's racial. Well, okay, like I said, so is me buying a coffee. Focusing on police brutality and not the racial element seems to be pandering to white sensitivities who feel alienated when the issue becomes divisive along racial lines. Just because white people feel the need to be defensive when institutionalized racism is challenged doesn't mean we have to pander to those sensitivities to be less divisive. That is ignoring the problem. That is not the solution. The solution is to identify and recognize all the problems present. And I completely agree. The rational thing to do is to identify where actual institutional racism exists, where structural racism exists, and eradicate that. I'm totally for that. Totally agree. Is this the way that you do it, though, I guess is the question. Do you utilize a specific event like this that has no evidence, the event itself for sure, that has no evidence of being a racist event, an event that's motivated by a racist person? You know, I mean, if that's the case, then maybe we are post-racial. If you don't have other events to point to that exist where there actually is a racist element to it, right? Where there is some profiling that's clear and evident, then maybe we are post-racial. And I'm not suggesting we are, because I don't think we are by any stretch of the imagination. I'm just saying, if you've got to, you know, ruin another man's life, you know, one man is already dead, and now you have to ruin another man's event to make him the poster boy for all of these other problems when there's no evidence that he was racist, I think is is irrational and unfair. I think you've got to have plenty of other instances to point to that have clear elements of racism and profiling and things like that that could get the national dialogue going, right? You're conflating racial and racist, and I think that's a bad idea. With that said, I wholeheartedly believe there is a corruption within the police force. You're probably right. And a major problem with punishing police officers who engage in brutality against victims, irrespective of their race. Totally agree. We've all seen the few YouTube videos that are out there, and we have also heard many of the stories. I think this is a structural problem. I think it requires a dialogue, I think, by everyone as to what we expect from those who govern us, because of course they govern us, but they're supposed to govern us at our behest, right? They're supposed to be there to do our bidding. And when they brutalize the innocent, or when they overreact even towards someone who has committed a crime, we have to ask ourselves a question: who are they working for? And so I think that's a dialogue we need to have for sure. There are countless white victims as well as black victims, but the presence of white victims at the hand of police does not diminish the merit of the claims that there is racism within the police force. Totally agree. That there is racial profiling, and that the Michael Brown incident highlights and represents a problem of having white power structure governing and enforcing laws in a predominantly black neighborhood. Well, I don't know. I'm a little bit concerned about that last sentence there, because I think if race doesn't matter, then it shouldn't matter. You know, we should be able to expect rationality and honor, you know, in our police structure. And if we can't trust them to be impartial and to be objective when it comes to, you know, operating in a neighborhood that has a different racial makeup than they themselves hold, then can we really trust them to be objective and honorable conducting their duties at all? And personally, I don't really think so. I don't know. I mean, you know, maybe I'm too naive about the possibilities there. I don't understand how we become post-racial if we are still concerned constantly about race in those instances, and treat people as individuals. I mean, I made a video recently where I talked about individuality, and that's what I think is important. You know, project yourself into the world as an individual, expect to be treated as an individual, and treat others as individuals. And we see race and gender as secondary or tertiary, or, you know, far on down the line, as things that, yes, they exist and they form part of who we are, but they don't form part of any relevant characteristic that determines how we deal with one another, right? We deal with one another as human beings first, individuals first, and all of the other characteristics form just part of the unique substructures of who we are as individuals. But they don't dictate how we treat one another and how we react with one another. Anyway, I really, you know, once again, I appreciate your comment. I really do. And I just want to reiterate, you know, the main issue that I had with your video was not the emotion, but the lack of rationality. I totally understand people being emotional. You know, it's part of the reason why I think it was even Sean Hannity. And yes, I'm exposing that I watch a lot of Fox News. To me, it's interesting to see the talking points of those people. And a lot of it's unintentional comedy, especially Bill O'Reilly. But you do see some interesting things on there. And Sean Hannity had some of the victims' families on there, and has discussed the victims' families. You know, the Trayvon Martin's family, and Eric Garner's family, of course, and Michael Brown's family, and some of the comments that they have made. And he's just basically said, yeah, it's okay for them to say that. They're upset. They get license, right? He's recognizing that they're emotional and that they're too close to the situation, and they've lost their son. And you know what? You let them, they can say whatever they want. They get to say whatever they want. And that's a recognition of this emotional element. But they don't get to do whatever they want, right? I actually just watched a crime and punishment show tonight, a forensics show, where a guy had killed somebody, and another person, a friend of the family, was interviewed, and he said, I'd like to just get him out on a pardon one day so I could just take him over to the family's house and let them alone with them in a room, right? And, you know, this is what I'm getting at is, of course, that's what we don't do, right? Because there's no way for them to be impartial. There's no way for them to be objective. And all you have to do if you really, you know, if it's necessary to understand the gravity, that's to just turn the situation around, as I made an example earlier, right? You would hope that your fellow citizens would be objective and rational and impartial when assessing your involvement in some kind of a situation. Probably many of us have been there, and we would definitely hope that emotion wouldn't rule the day if the shoe were on the other foot. And that's the problem, of course, that I have with all these riots and things like that. Is this is an irrational emotional response to something. I mean, Michael Brown's church got burned. You know, apparently the church that he attended. I saw this on the Dr. Phil show today. I mean, how rational is that, right? And so, you know, that's why the appeal to rationality. I don't want to see you rationalizing riots. I want to see an appeal to rationality and reach out and say, I understand, I feel your pain, brothers and sisters. This is horrible what happened, but we've got to be civilized here. You know, we can't resort to vigilantism. That's not what makes a great country great. And so, anyway, I invite any further discourse. I can't promise any more video responses or anything like that. After this one, you probably don't want one. Not because I disagree with you, but probably because I'm too long-winded. For everyone else, thanks as always for watching. Oh, and one more thing. After watching my video back to do some editing, I realized that I kind of missed something here. And that was a paragraph where you said EnigmaHood, focusing on police brutality and not the racial element, seems to be pandering to white sensitivities who feel alienated when the issue becomes divisive along racial lines. I think that's a clever little bit of rationalization of taking a non-racist event and turning it racial. Again, there's no point in doing that if it's not if there aren't racist overtones to the event. Then I think you're sort of commandeering the event. You know, it just happens to be convenient then that there are racial elements there for you to commandeer the event, to use it to further an agenda, and then to further sort of dismiss any criticism of that by then attacking the sensitivities and pandering to white sensitivities, which I gotta say, I guess I'm not going to be quite so uncharitable as to say that's a racist thing to say, but it sure isn't real charitable, and it sounds a little generalizing to me. Just because white people feel the need to be defensive when institutionalized racism is challenged doesn't mean we have to pander to those sensitivities just to be less divisive. Nobody's asking you to be less divisive, but I think what we are asking here is to be rational about that. Because again, if there aren't racial overtones to the situation, then to turn it into a racial event is to mischaracterize the event. And again, if you don't have enough other events to point to that are clearly racist, then maybe you don't have much of an issue at all. And again, I want to be clear, I'm not suggesting you have no issue. I think you do, and I think there are lots of events that you could point to, which means that I don't understand why it is you would need to take an event that doesn't have racist overtones to it and sort of react as though it does. And I think that this whole concept of pandering to white sensitivities, and just because white people feel the need to be defensive, etc., is just a way of stifling any kind of challenge to that. And I think that's a little bit beneath you, right? Again, I'm not going to be as uncharitable as to say that what you're saying is racist, but you're really generalizing here, and I think you need to be careful. I think, you know, all you have to do again is imagine the shoe on the other foot, right? If someone said, hey, just because black people feel etc., you'd be saying, hey, listen, you don't get to generalize all black people. What the hell are you doing? Right? And, you know, I know that even saying something like that, here's the funny part about this whole idea of racism, right? All I've got to do is make a suggestion about something, and I can be deemed a racist, right? And that's one of those stifling accusations, right? Because all someone has to do is say, hey, this person is a racist. And if you're a white guy, particularly, it's pretty hard to dig yourself out from under that, even if the accusation has no merit whatsoever, right? And I think that's some of the things that sometimes other people don't consider. Lenatar recently made some comments about just self-preservation in the light of being approached by a police officer, and he was immediately labeled a racist. And these are things that I do. I mean, the things that I've heard said, Dr. Phil mentioned it on his show as well today. He said basically you do whatever you have to do to get home safely, which means yes sir, no sir. If the guy wants to put handcuffs on you, you just go along with that. And if it's unjust, you deal with that after the fact. And there's nothing racial about that. This is something I do myself. I'm just not willing to challenge a police officer in the moment on a dark road at night or something like that. I want to come home at night. And if the guy is being a jackass, I'll get his number later on, right? And if you're going to say that black people don't have the opportunity to quote unquote get his number later on, that's a discussion we could have. To me, that, there's racial overtones there, and that's part of the problem that needs to be addressed. I get that. I totally understand that. So, keep in mind that when I say these things, it is because I care, but I care enough to try to attach some rationality to my emotion and let that dictate the approach that I take. So anyway, once again, thanks for the dialogue, and take care of yourself.